Hi there and welcome to this video about using for loops in ELC. For loops are a particular type of structure in programming, and they are a repetition structure, meaning that we can get a certain piece of code to repeat a certain number of times. Now with for loops we know in advance exactly how many times we want it to run, and there are different or other repetition structures that we'll come to where you perhaps might not know in advance how many times you need it to run. But for loops we do know that, and so it's a particular type of structure, and we're going to go through how we use those. If we take the following app, or the one I've got on my screen here, okay, I've got a certain piece of code, GFX writeline hello, and I'd like that to run a certain number of times, and we can see that that's the case. Now, okay, we might look at that for an app like this and think, well, just run it 6 times, what's the problem? But if I wanted to run it 200, 300 times or something like that, then it starts to get a little bit unwieldy, okay? And so there's a much more efficient way of doing it. And also, if we had, let's say, not just the one line of code we wanted to run, but a big chunk of code each time, then we'd want to be able to do that. So let's have a look at how this works. Well, what we'd like is to be able to take this stuff off of here, but before I do that I'm going to say, well, let's have a quick look at how this works at the moment, and we're going to have a quick look at it using the debugger as well. So if I run this app as it stands, okay, and then what I'm going to do this time is go back to run the app with the debugger, so click that button there, okay, and if I just move my thing over here a little bit, we can see it says run highlighted line, okay, so we can run this one line at a time. So if I go in and say, well, I want to run that line, so we get to the first line there, and if we click it again, then we can see it's run that first line, okay, and I'm about to run the second line, so run that one, you can see that's run, okay, and this is our normal sequence that we expect to happen, okay, one thing happens after another, so we say keep running these lines, okay, and when we reach the last line and we run that, then it highlights the before and after curly brackets, if you like, that held the whole program. Okay, so that's the way that's worked. So we've done each of these. Now let's actually sort of see what happens when we run this with a loop or a for loop. So I'm going to come back to my code, okay, and what I know I want to do is I'm going to take these out and put a for loop in to make this work. Okay, now the code for a for loop, okay, requires us to have something called a loop counter. Now that's just a variable, and we can call it anything if we want, but I'm going to call it loop counter here so that we get used to calling it loop counter. Otherwise it might start talking about it as, oh, that variable that you use with a loop. Well, it's called a loop counter, so if I call it that now, when I name my variable, then it makes it easier to remember. Okay, so like with any other variable, it's local, okay, and I'm going to call that loop counter. And notice, because I'm not putting a string or a $sign at the end of it, then we know that this is a number variable. So the code for my for loop, okay, is for, okay, and then we have the name of the loop counter, okay, equals, then we put in a range, okay, so, and when we first put whatever the first number is what we set loop counter to at the start. We initialize that variable. So loop counter equals, let's say we do from 1 to 6. And then we put in how much of a change to the value loop counter we're going to put in each time it goes through the loop. So I'm going to want this to just change by 1 each time. So it's going to move up from 1 to 6, and it's going to change in 1 increment each time. So if I put that in, now I then have a set of curly brackets that say where the loop starts and ends. So I'm going to put it in like that. It's good practice to indent your code inside of a for loop so that you can see where it is, and we can see that this code effectively is inside of this for loop because it's inside of this and this curly brackets. So let's actually sort of think about what's going to happen here. Okay, so this is for loop counter, so it sets loop counter equal to 1, okay, and then it says while it's between 1 and 6, run this code okay, and then step loop counter up by 1 each time. Okay, so if I was to run this now, so save the source and check. Okay, and you can see that's worked. Okay, and we've got our 6 hellos there, so that's done our job for us. Okay, but if I go into run the app with the debugger again now, let's actually see how that works. So here's our thing again, so run the highlighted line. Okay, so for loop counter equals 1 to 6, step 1, so it's going to run that highlighted line there. Okay, run, and we can see it jumps back up to the top to check what value loop counter is, which is currently going to be 2 because we've stepped it up by 1. Okay, and we can see it runs around this loop and keeps going, okay, until it does it the 6th time, and then it checks again, finds that loop counter is now equal to 7 and does this. But it's difficult for us to see that because I'm saying, well, it checks it that loop counter is equal to 6 or 7, and we're like, well, how do you know? Well, let's go back and edit the source and let's put something into our loop to check. Okay, so if I did gfx dot right line, okay, and I'm going to put in there loop counter is currently set to, okay, and then actually put the variable in there. Right, so now let's have a look at our code. Oh, got a problem there. Let's just go back. Oh, forgot my speech marks. Okay. Right, so we can see it still works. We can see it's actually showing the loop counter variable. So let's actually go in and run it with the debugger so we can see what's actually happening. Okay, so let's scroll this over a little bit. Okay, so run highlighted line. Okay, so loop counter is currently, we set it to 1, okay, and because 1 is between 1 and 6, it goes inside of the loop to handle this code here. So let's sort of see where we're at. So run the highlighted line. Okay, so it's going to print out hello. Tells us that loop counter is currently set to, and it's 1. Okay, at which point, because we've reached the end of that loop, it steps it up by 1. Okay, and so loop counter is now 2, and because that's between 1 and 6, it's now going to run again. And we can see loop counter is set to 2, jumps back up, steps it up to 3. Okay, so loop counter is now 3, which is still between 1 and 6, so it runs the code. Okay, steps it up to 4, so loop counter is 4, which is between 1 and 6, so it runs the code. Okay, steps up to 5, which is between 1 and 6, so it runs the code. Okay, steps it up to 6 now, which is still between 1 and 6, so it runs the code. Now it steps it up to 7. Now loop counter at 7 is not between 1 and 6, so this time it finishes. Job done. Okay, so that's how our loop works in uSource, or in ELC in uSource. Okay, so that's a for loop. Okay, where we use for loops when we know in advance how many times we'd like a particular piece of code to run.